Welcome back to the Middle East Forum in the Morning. Today is Wednesday, August 8th. My next guest is someone that I had the privilege of getting to know, sitting in Philadelphia outside of the public broadcasting headquarters, a few hours after our organization had had a dinner with several NATO parliamentarians, and the day before we ended up receiving the anger of the president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. But that's a story for another time. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, an organization that advocates for the preservation of the founding principles of the U.S. Constitution, liberty and freedom, through the separation of mosque and state. Dr. Jasser previously served as commissioner and vice chair to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom and regularly briefs members of the House and Senate on the threat of political Islam. Most recently, he testified in front of the House Oversight and Government Reform Subcommittee on national security on the global threat of the Muslim Brotherhood, and more, I think appropriately, the threat that it poses here in the United States. Good morning, Zuhdi.
Good morning. It's great to be with you. Congratulations on the new program.
Thank you very much, and thanks for joining us today. We wanted you to be one of the first guests. We've had a great, I think, decade-long relationship, maybe 15 years now, with you and your organization, and it's really a pleasure to have you as one of our first guests. So, we know more about your organization, we know more about this issue, but before we get into the issue we're going to talk about, you started out your career in the medical field as an internist and cardiologist. What led you to go from being a doctor to start getting involved with grassroots activism and forming AIFD in 2003?
Well, after I left the Navy, I came to Phoenix to join my father in practice, and then 9/11 happened, and realized that almost every voice that was speaking on behalf of our community were offshoots of this Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups in the West, and also offshoots of what I call petro-Islam. And I realized, no different than our founding fathers, be it Benjamin Rush, who was a physician that was one of the founding fathers, be it Maimonides, that was a scholar in Judaism, but was also a physician. I think in history there are many scholars that may not necessarily be theologians, but yet take significant leadership roles in faith traditions and reform. And especially now when you look at where Islam is in its history, theocrats are positioned to solidify their power as a result of the vacuums being created as dictatorships change, or these vacuums can create opportunities, and it's an opportunity for us that live in freedom here in America. You know, my parents escaped Syria and the dictatorship of Hafez and then Bashar Assad. And I'll tell you, as much as the changes will have to be centered in the Middle East and Muslim-majority countries, we have a laboratory to do things here that we just can't do. Organizations like our American Islamic Forum would not last but a few months in Egypt or in Syria or in Iraq. And ultimately, I think we have a responsibility as Americans to lead reform globally here in America.
What do you see as the biggest threat to the American Muslim community, and how do you see a way to combat radicalization that may be going on within it or by other forces overseas that are trying to influence it?
I think there are two major threats. One is the solidification of dictatorships and especially Islamist theologians, be it the Khomeinis on the Shia side or the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafi jihadists of the Wahhabis on the Sunni side. The other threat is complacency, the silent majority, almost like the Germans that tolerated Nazism and then complained to be victims. I think the majority of Muslims that are here in America are here to escape the Islamism, but yet we face a threat of complacency, silence, fear, and I think that's been my biggest challenge. As you know, we've been working together for almost 15 years, and yet what I thought would have been progress we would have made in 15 years, as much as I'm proud of a lot of the accomplishments we've made, the complacency of living in a country where Islamists know they would never take over, but yet my colleagues see the problem and yet they're doing nothing. And I think that's one of the primary threats I see to our community.
Do you feel like with the Trump presidency and the ascendancy of his, after his election to the White House, that the issues that you've been fighting for the last decade and a half have received more public attention?
They've certainly, I think, there's been a time now that the Islamists have had much less influence and they're not guiding the agenda, definitely, of the White House or elsewhere. But I think some of the balkanization in America has prevented some of the bipartisan nature of working together that we've needed to bring attention to women's rights, gay rights, freedom, free speech, all the things that should be at the forefront. that I think President Trump has pointed out that there are problems within Muslim majority communities, yet because of the Trump derangement syndrome have prevented us from focusing together on areas of domestic and foreign policy.
Now let's focus on an issue that you recently testified on in front of Congress regarding the global and also domestic threat that the Muslim Brotherhood may pose. Now, I've heard the argument that when someone says the Muslim Brotherhood in America, they say, well, who's the head of it? Who's the Shura Council? Who's responsible for it? This is somewhat of an amorphous idea. We have to get much more specific when we're talking about banning an organization like the Ikhwaniyya, the Arabic name for the brothers. But what do you see as the U.S.'s biggest challenge in designating this group as a terror organization, or maybe its different appendages? And why do you think it's been so difficult for either Congress or this administration to do so?
I think it's because of the infiltration of countries like Qatar, who are all in with being sort of the mothership of the Muslim Brotherhood globally. And when they fund organizations like Brookings, etc., they've created this mantra that somehow we as Muslims need to accept this bigotry of low expectations, where we have to accept the deception that the Brotherhood has nonviolent arms and the violent arms have nothing to do with the nonviolent arms, which is basically telling the Muslim population that we have to live under the boots of theocrats for the rest of our lives. When in fact, I think the way to look at it is, you begin by declaring them a foreign terrorist organization with their mothership in Egypt, and then organizations that are also Brotherhood, be it in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, and elsewhere, also become FTOs. And in the West, where they are not operating under the name Muslim Brotherhood. Now, London they are, so we could discuss whether that would also be an FTO. But in America, you will find quickly, even though CARE and the Islamic Society of North America are definitely offshoots, fruit of that poison tree, since they're not designating themselves Muslim Brotherhood, they will actually wither on the vine within 5 to 10 years. A good example is the Holy Land Foundation. We were able to shut down the Holy Land Foundation without even designating them an FTO because they were funding the Brotherhood of Hamas. So ultimately, by designating major global entities of the Brotherhood foreign terrorist organizations, you will begin to suffocate the Western arms of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right. It's kind of when you poison the well, you end up getting the entire population to understand that it's no longer worth their while to be part of that movement. Now, you mentioned Qatar in the opening remarks to the last question. I'd like to read from a report regarding Arizona public schools that was published in the National Review on January 27th. On January 27th, Qatar Foundation International sponsored a continuing education event titled Middle East 101 for public school teachers in Phoenix, Arizona, hosted by the Arizona Department of Education, which is not surprising given that QFI has donated over $450,000 to Arizona public schools and over $30 million to public schools across the country. Unfortunately, while there was a good deal of interesting material, teachers also got a large helping of Islamist propaganda designed to influence American school children and ultimately to advance Qatari foreign policy. How do you react to the Qataris not just trying to influence what's going on in Washington, D.C., but getting to a very, very local level, even your proverbial backyard?
I know, and thank you so much for bringing that up. It saddens me that here's an issue that we've been trying to shake the trees on here locally in Phoenix and in Arizona, and your leadership from Philadelphia is bringing an attention to an issue that we've tried to expose here in Arizona. And the bottom line is unfortunately, when you look at foreign diplomacy, people think that, well, as long as the Qataris have a military base there, and they're reaching out with an outstretched hand to be our allies in foreign policy, geopolitical issues in the region, then they must be our allies. And never mind the fact that the leading cleric in Qatar, who's friends with the Al Thani family that runs that government, is Qaradawi. And Sheikh Qaradawi is banned from coming to the West. He has a following that includes 60 million that watch his show, Sharia in Life, and has been a Holocaust denier, has advocated for terror against American troops, against Israeli citizens, on, has been responsible for the radicalization of many future Al-Qaeda operatives that we have targeted in war. And yet we seem to reject this and ignore it when foundations in America, like the Arizona one you mentioned, then start working with Qatar, ignoring what Yusuf Qaradawi does. We have at our organization translated his Arabic site and what his plans were in 2009 before the Arab awakening started, that his version of Islamic democracy is actually a theodemocracy. So the world vision of the worldview of the Qataris has nothing in common with American worldview. And it would be like if in the Cold War, states like Arizona were working with communist organizations because they happened to not be in the Soviet, empire, when in fact they had the same ideology. And that's what we need to educate Americans, including starting here in Arizona, about why we shouldn't be bonding with the Qataris and other apologists for the Brotherhood.
I want to get a little more granular, because on this show we're trying to highlight issues that otherwise are not receiving national attention. Let's go back to this report from the National Review and see exactly what the Qatari-funded, Muslim Brotherhood-friendly Qatar Foundation is offering to K through 12 students in Arizona public schools, and probably by guilt of association, many other public schools throughout the United States. This is a quote. Lesson plans contain anti-Semitic and anti-American material, particularly several lessons promoted by the Zinn Foundation, which claims to promote a revisionist people's history. These include Greed as a Weapon, Teaching the Other Iraq War, which examines the greed of the corporations ostensibly responsible for the Iraq War in order to, I quote, feast on Iraq's economy. And another lesson plan, Who's Terrorism?, which questions the definition of terrorism, creating scenarios for students to discuss. For example, if Israeli soldiers taunting and shooting children in Palestinian refugee camps with the assistance of U.S. military aid should be considered an example of terrorism. I could not imagine any of my children who go to public school to be subject to these lesson plans. And what I can't believe is the acquiescence of public school officials and the Arizona Secretary of Education, anyone else who has been made available of these subjects, or even local officials, knowing that they are inviting a foreign power to indoctrinate American students in lessons that are anathema to our values. What do you have to say about that?
I couldn't agree more. And when people wonder why it is that you can get videos where you go on campuses and you see students basically not even be able to recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization, or even recognize the threat of the ISIS flag and others, and yet they are anti-American and see our troops as evil. It's coming from the fact that you have funding coming from the enemies of America, anti-Semitic organizations. I mean, the Middle East Studies Association is based out of Tucson here, and some of the vile literature coming out of there, that Middle East Studies Association, and it is not a coincidence that they tried to suppress the release of the ISIS documents coming out of Syria that even the New York Times reported on. They wanted them suppressed. So all of this runs together. When you have funding, it's not just one piece of education, the material coming out of it. When I was on the U.S. Commission and we were trying to expose the radicalization of textbooks that were written by the Saudis would say, oh, we'll white out this, we'll remove this paragraph or not. It's like taking Mein Kampf and saying that you could white out parts of it and no longer make it a Nazi ideology. This is ideology coming from Qatar.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And on this program, we're going to focus especially close on what's going on in Arizona, and we hope to have you back maybe in a few weeks to give us an update. That's all the time we have today. Dr. Jasser, Zuchti, thank you so much for joining us.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.